Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started here, friends.
hmm
We're to that time. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Kent Smith, and I am a part of the Eden community in Abilene, Texas, and we want to welcome you to this third and final set of workshops this Saturday and next Saturday as well on the topic of uh, life-giving communities and life-giving communication, growing a culture of life-giving communication. It turns out that life-giving communities have to have life-giving communication. And so we are very excited about this conversation that will be rocking along these next 2 weekends. Today we will have some wonderful participation by some very gifted panelists, and look forward to that, as well as a great conversation following that panel discussion, in which all those who are participating will have a chance to reflect on communication in their own communities. And then we'll wrap up toward the end of that time with some reflections and a guiding question taking us into next week's conversation about community. So again, want to just welcome everyone here. I'm going to pray in just a moment and invite the Lord's leadership over this time together. And then I want to introduce the panelists that we'll be having a chance to share a conversation with over the next 40 minutes or so. But let's begin with the prayer, and then we'll commence from there. Lord, we thank you today for the goodness of your steadfast love that comes to us fresh every morning, your mercies that never come to an end. Because you're the God who is love, you're the God who is always and relentlessly sharing of yourself with others, with us, as your people, as your children. And we know, Lord, that it is at the very heart of your life of love to be communicating with grace, with clarity, with effectiveness. So we invite you, Lord, as we begin this conversation about communication, to be our teacher and our leader. May your good spirit be among us. And we pray your special blessing on our panelists as they lead our thoughts in these minutes ahead. We're grateful to be people who live in and for the love of God. And we invite you now to guide us in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, um, we have um, we have four panelists who are going to address some questions related to community communication. Um, when this conversation was initially posed by the steering committee of Nurturing Communities Network, David Jansen was observing how critically important it is in our time when it seems like communication is being so poorly modeled, often by even the leaders in our society, for those of us who are seeking to follow Jesus to be exemplars and models of what that kind of communication could look like and should look like. And we're going to give special focus to our impact on the wider world in our second session. So Alden Bass will be guiding us in that conversation. Today, we really want to focus on sort of the heart of it for those of us who are in community, which is how we ourselves are learning to engage in life-giving communication. And that's a tall order. It'd be great to be light in the world with the communication skills that we have, but the truth is that all of us, I think, who have been at this a while know just how challenging it is to be effective communicators. And so we're very privileged today to have some very experienced and wise communication and conversation partners around this topic. Let me introduce them briefly, and then we're going to dive right into our questions. So uh, from from the Bruderhof, we are very blessed to have Claire Stober with us. Those of you who know the Bruderhof know that Claire is a very important light in that community. She's just been the editor of this wonderful book, Another Life is Possible. We've got it on our coffee table, and it's such a beautiful testimony to the lives and the culture that God has created through Bruderhof over the past 100 years. Claire's done a brilliant job in telling that story, and she obviously, having done that, has lots of evidence of experience with communication in community. We're delighted that Claire is with us. We also have from the Genesis community in Minnesota, Andrew Howard. Andrew is a part of the is a part of the NCN steering committee and is really our facilitator in our steering committee gatherings. Brings a wealth of experience in formal and informal communication in his community life there. We're delighted to have Andrew with us. We also have Laura Lassertimer from the Common Home Farm in Illinois, in Bloomington, near Bloomington. I never got clear about whether that was Indiana or Illinois, but we're delighted to have Laura with us. She has experience in some specific approaches to communication that we're very eager to have input around. And finally, we have Chris Smith from Englewood Christian. Chris is the editor of the Englewood Review, has written a number of wonderful books on community. Slow Church is a book you should read if you haven't read it yet. And more recently, he has written How the Body of Christ Talks, recovering the communication of, well, I've lost the subtitle there, Chris, but
the practice of conversation.
There we go, Recovering the Practice of Conversation, which is a wonderfully practical book, and I highly recommend it to any of us who are in the process of trying to get a better handle on sort of the nuts and bolts of how communication works in community. So 4 wonderful panelists, full of ability and background in this topic. I want to begin with a question, and I think I'll just ask you all to kind of in order, kind of move through with a first response to this initial question. And the question is this: where have you found good communication to be especially important in your community's life together? And let's just kind of move through with starting with Claire, if you would, and then Andrew, and then Laura, and then Chris, if you'll take anchor on that round. So again, where have you found good communication to be especially important in your community's life together? Claire, let's go with you first.
Okay. I would say good communication actually starts with your first relationships. The family is the core of community. And so there needs to be strong communication between spouses, from parent to child also, or child to parent, but within families. And then from there, you need to be able to communicate with your brothers and sisters. And without that core communication going on, everything else on a communal level can easily be posturing. And you need to have that strong communication skills interpersonally, and then more corporately. And then, of course, communicating feelings, not just thoughts, so that people can actually deal with what are, root causes of misunderstanding, so to speak. And it's going to be, the other thing is that I would say that the best, what I've learned is over communicate, especially on practical kind of matters. It's very easy to misunderstand, misinterpret on practical as well as more inner kind of connections with one another, so that have the courage to go back and say, did I understand this correctly? Or I just want to get this clear, or I'm not sure I quite got that. And then over communicate with one another. And we do so much in community. I'm very open to having any of the other Bruderhook members here unmute yourselves and pop in, because I don't feel quite adequate to convey it all. But I think what's also really important in communicating is being transparent. Um, um, you know, say what you mean what you say, be who you are as much as possible. These are all pretty basic things, but in the 22-minute video that we watched of, what you would be talking about, I thought there were some really great ideas of, actual structured ways to communicate that um, other communities are experiencing or practicing. And so I'm very open and really interested to hear that today.
Thank you, Claire. That's really helpful to get us launched there. Andrew, what would you add to that?
Sure. So yesterday around the dinner table, uh, I was talking to my wife, and I asked her the question. So, where have you found good communication to be especially important in your community's life together? In preparation for today, sometimes it's helpful to ask a friend or a spouse for some ideas. And her response was, "It's important everywhere. It's important." In all of our life here in community. It's important when there are disagreements in a community so that you can articulate the pain that ails you. It's important when there is agreement in a community so that you can articulate the joy that brings. But if I were to choose one time when communication is most important, I would say it's most important for changes, especially as I'm starting to get older and change is harder, and the people around me are getting older and change is harder for them too. Uh, Whenever there's a change, it's really important. So if somebody's moving out, everybody needs to know, when somebody wants to move in and there's a potential of a new housemate who has different opinions or just a different just new people coming in. Everybody needs to be aware of this change so that if they want to, they can be involved in the interview process. Basically, when there's any change, the question needs to be asked about who needs to be notified about the change and who needs to be involved in the decision making for making that change. In our community, we've uh, organized, we have a community document called the Genesis Community Covenant in Practice. And in there, it highlights the different areas or the different spheres that make changes. So if something's a small decision that with low impact, that individuals can just make that change. It's not a big deal. We have different teams in our community. So we've got a house meeting team, a special events team, which might do a Christmas party, harvest party, a regional nurturing communities network gathering, recruiting and storyteller team, so that when new people join the community, they can hear the story of where we've been and where we are, so that people know more about our community before moving in. Communications and website team, pastoral care team, prayer and worship or prayer and outreach team, worship team, finance, house maintenance, and supplies manager teams. So there's all these different teams, and they all kind of have their sphere, where they're responsible for certain areas. Everybody gets on a team in our community. Um, and so then if there's we have three community houses. They're next door to each other, and we share backyards. And so it's really nice. They're very large Victorians, 10 to 8 bedroom houses. And so there's enough people in each house where, there's house meetings that happen every week. And so each house gets to decide what happens in their house. But then there's also a structure in our community where people join in as apprentices, and then after a year they can choose to become a partner member. And then if they're more interested in being involved in the leadership in the community, they can become a covenant member. Uh, and so then there's partner member decisions, which might be changes to the Genesis community practice, or approving new partner members, or distributing benevolence funds. Covenant members, would make larger decisions, maybe accountability to the covenant in sensitive manners, approving new covenant members, or significant unbudgeted financial decisions. And board members, as a nonprofit, the board members govern the community and have delegated the covenant and partner members to run and operate the Genesis community. So there's different areas, and whenever there's a change, there needs to be good, effective communication. And sometimes it's the simple things, right? So when there are too many coffee mugs in the kitchen and we need to downsize because there's 50 coffee mugs, and you accidentally downsize your housemate's favorite coffee mug because you don't think it's particularly attractive, there might be some hurt feelings about that. So changes, whenever there's changes, there needs to be communication. And that's the main reason why communication is so important, so that because if you don't, you will hurt somebody. One of my buddies in the community told me that it's better to over communicate than under communicate. He said that if you over communicate, you might annoy some people with too much communication, but that if you under communicate, you will hurt somebody's feelings, and that's a much deeper wound. Yeah. Just one last thing. One thing that I'm continually rediscovering is that words matter. That the words that we choose and the way that we choose to say those words communicate more than just a simple string of words strung together in a random semblance. They communicate where we're coming from, our intent for why we're saying what we're saying, the angle from which we're approaching the topic at hand, and they may convey a desire or a need for listeners to take action. Words matter more than I ever thought. One example of how words matter is in labeling language. In a situation where someone hurts you, a bad communicator might say that you are a bad person because you hurt me. Those words label the person as bad, but a good communicator may say that when you did this thing, you hurt me, and that makes me feel bad. And that's a better communication style, because you're labeling the action, not the person. So yeah, so words matter, and communicate.
They matter everywhere, it sounds like, Andrew. Yeah, thank you for that. And
Yeah.
it strikes me what you're saying really connects deeply with what Claire was saying about how communication is learned in family first and foremost.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason that the layer of detail that you've outlined for us in your community there feels so overwhelming, even to me in some ways, is because so many of us didn't grow up in healthy extended family where communication was kind of the norm. So we're all having to learn this stuff. Many of us are multiple generations in our families away from healthy extended intergenerational interdependent community. And so this is all for those of us who are deeply steeped in a Western individualistic world, a big tall order. But I want to come back to some of what you're saying there, Andrew, about how this ramifies out into how a community is structured. I can see how that might feel overwhelming to someone who's just kind of getting started on the community journey and trying to figure out how in the world do we begin to wrap our arms around all the layers of communication that we've just heard described so well. Laura, let's go to you next. What would you add to what's been said so far?
I assume I might be the only Laura here. Is that right?
Yes, you are the very one.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi, I'm Laura.
Laura.
I'm part of the Common Home Farm Catholic worker. I guess I would add that the process that we use and the spaces we set up for having those big conversations also plays a huge factor in how we're able to communicate with each other. I think we have to prepare ourselves to access our best selves when we're in difficult conversations. And there are rituals and practices that help us do that. Because if we're coming into meetings carrying the stress of the day and all the energy and unsaid things, then it can be hard to access that. I'm thinking of, we had a farm retreat last weekend, and we've taken to using some of the practices of the circle way. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but it comes a lot out of a writing group I'm a part of. So we open with prayer, obviously, and a candle, and then we have some writing prompts that we use, and we all spend time together in the room, but taking 15 minutes to write to those prompts and then share them aloud. And from there, we can kind of see where we need to go next, because each person has had a chance to be heard without interruption and, without apology. And that led us to some really great places last Saturday, as we noticed what ways we were answering questions and what maybe we didn't say that we were surprised by.
Mm.
So, and we also use a talking stone in those circles so that we know who's speaking, we know that we will have our turn, and that it's a fair, that the process is not dominated by the person with the biggest opinion or the loudest voice. So yeah, I think that's the main thing that I would add. It's been very fruitful for us.
Two things really stand out to me, Laura, and what you're saying there. One is creating space for us to be still and really think a bit about what we really want to say, and so that idea of sitting and writing, and then, like you say, creating an opportunity where people know for sure my voice will be heard here. And so that changes all kinds of dynamics in the communication, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. Very important. Mm-hmm. Chris, let's go to you next.
Yeah, there's a few.
Go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say there's a great book called The Circle Way, if anybody's interested in learning more. And there's religious communities and even like healthcare networks, places in the corporate world that use the Circle Way process for their decision-making structure. So yeah, just wanted to throw that out there if anybody's interested in looking into that.
That's great. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, there's been so many wonderful things that have been said already. I mean, I think the thought that was first on my mind was the one that Andrew started out with, simply that good communication matters everywhere. There's nowhere that it doesn't matter. I think we are created in the image of a relational, that is conversational God, and that kind of saturates all of our being. And I appreciate the things Laura was saying about the intentionality and that the way that we structure conversations, I do believe is really important. I think it's helpful. It's been helpful for me to think of whatever conversation we find ourselves in, to think of it as a form of prayer, that God is with us, even if we're just talking to our spouse or to a neighbor or a brother or sister in our community. God is there with us, and God is in us and among us, and to enter into that conversation as a sort of prayer with concern for the life and the movement of the Spirit among us. I think one other thing that kind of came to my mind in thinking about this question beforehand, and this has kind of been alluded to in some of the things that Laura said and Andrew said, but we try here at Englewood to be as non-hierarchical in our decision-making and our life as possible. And I think because we have chosen that way, I think that good communication is particularly important because of that. Oftentimes, sort of hierarchical decision-making can become a shortcut to take us around messy conversations and conversations in which all members have an opportunity to speak into. I kind of heard of some notes of that in what Laura was saying. And so trying to live into the way of Jesus of not lording it over one another, but seeing each other as brothers and sisters and friends, and having one Lord and one Master who is among us, as I was saying earlier, and guiding us, really has shaped the sorts of practices of conversation that we have, whether that's our intentional weekly gathering for conversation or just smaller conversations or conversations that we have about our work or life together in our neighborhood. So those are a few thoughts that are kind of off the top of my head. I'm sure we'll get probably into some more as we go along.
Really helpful, Chris. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think the in part because communication is not good communication is not just automatically something that people in community have. This whole idea that we build rhythms of attention, I like to say, we build rhythms of practice where we have a chance to do this steadily. And what this is, I think, is an intriguing question. And maybe let's turn our attention to that question next. So if you were going to kind of drill down into a little bit more of the detail of how you find this working well in community, what are some of the most helpful ways for strengthening community through communication, better communication that you have seen? Talk about those practices, those rhythms, or just those kind of core commitments that seem to be making a difference in the health of your community over time. Let's just kind of take the same order here. So we'll go back, Claire, to you to start with.
Well, what I heard on the first go around from a lot of people was good communication. The goal of it is to avoid hurt and or for people to feel hurt by poor communication. And I think what's really important is that whatever we do, it shows trust from one person to another. And that most often that trust is shown, or one feels trusted when one is listened to. One thing I've learned in community is that my ideas are not always the best ones. But being human, I do like to feel that they've been listened to. And I think if they've just been listened to, that's all that matters. For me, at least, I feel like, okay, I said it now, I'll leave it there. And so listening, I think, is really helpful, especially people talking to those in a semi-hierarchical situation who want to feel listened to by the hierarchy. I also and would encourage that, email and other texting and other things, it's really difficult to convey tone of voice, as we all know in those. And so if you've got something important to say, go face to face and do that as much as possible. I think we've all been struggling through this time of COVID in finding ways to communicate with one another, or stay in communication and in connection with one another. And I know in our community, we've been struggling for different ways to keep that that sense of community alive and living. And you know, we've tried this and tried that, and I think everyone has a different threshold of what they feel works or doesn't work. But I think that's been especially challenging since March for any of the communal groups here. I want to go back to this question here. I would say the other thing that really helps keeping, I'm sure every one of you has some sort of apparatus within your community for addressing or avoiding gossip. Gossip can really stifle communication or in many ways erode it. And just to be very upfront about it and to be very clear about the damage it can do and to address it directly. I'm just trying to think of other ways that we've addressed it that would be helpful to the group. Toby or Dave or Tim, any thoughts coming to you all?
What you just mentioned, Claire, we're often asked, so what are the rules at the Bruderhof about this or that or the other? And we as often as possible answer, there's only one rule, and it's the rule against gossip. And it's very, very hard to keep. But our founder, Eberhard Arnold, in the very beginning of this community 100 years ago, out of necessity of facing this damaging human tendency to gossip and rather go talk to somebody else about what bothers me, he said, let us all pledge to promise each other and hold each other to it, that we will go direct and speak the truth in love. We'll at least be open with our feelings and our hurts, but go direct to the one who's hurt us, offended us, or misunderstood us, or whatever it is. It's very, very hard to keep. And whenever we fail and look back and realize we failed, damage is there already in relationships. And it happens. We all fail in that. But we keep calling each other and ourselves back to the law of love, which is printed or lettered out, and it's on the wall across my living room here. And Eberhard, our founder, actually said at the end, let's all hang this up as an admonition in where we work and in our house, so we always have it before our eyes. We want to be open, listen to each other, speak to each other, and be silent if we can't. He said, without the rule of silence, which is biting your tongue rather than gossiping, there is no community.
Another structure for communication, and it's going to play into the next question, is in our community, since we are fairly large, we all know that at any time we can sit down and write to any of our elders or ministers or anyone to say exactly how we're feeling in a situation. And it's not going behind someone's back. It's more that, again, it's an amplification of that idea of needing to be listened to have the ear of someone about something that you feel very strongly about. And oftentimes when we are going to make a decision, the alternatives are laid out to the whole community. And in this case, we have to do it often by conference lines. And then there isn't always time, of course, for everyone to weigh in, but you know that you can write to the elder or whoever is making the decision with your input on it. And that's not only acceptable, it's really encouraged, and they need to know what we're thinking. And so to have this direct line to express what you're thinking and feeling.
Thank you, Claire and Toby. That is so helpful, and obviously lots and lots of decades and experience behind those words. And I hear an echo of what Laura was saying, and just how critically important it is to be in a context where I know my voice is going to be heard. You know, however things are structured in the community, if I know that, there's something that really changes in my levels of anxiety and frustration with the situation. If I know I'm really going to be taken seriously, that my voice is going to count. Yeah, thank you for that. Andrew, let's go to you next.
Great. So just to give people a little context, I already said that we have 3 large Victorian houses next to each other. There's 22 adults and 8 children amongst all the housemates here. So all from 6 to 60, I think are the ages here. And the rhythms that we've found helpful in developing better communication in our community. We have a potluck every Monday. Was a little bit more helpful to have that during the summer where we could meet outside and there was less concerns about meeting. But now that it is cold, it is we're gonna have to figure that one out. Whether it's maybe grab food and then eat in your own house or what, but we'll have to figure that one out. Balancing state requirements with the need and desire for good rhythms of community. We have a monthly community meeting, which we have figured out we had been meeting outside, but now we're splitting up into small groups and doing kind of a small Bible study kind of topic, which has been really helpful. We have weekly house meeting, like I mentioned. We have teams, like I mentioned. And because the size of our community is not too large, about 22 adults, we found that just texting and email is often helpful. So often with texts, you can only have up to 20 people in a group text. It's just a limitation of people's cell phones. So we have used the app GroupMe so that you can just add however many people you want, and then send out those communications through the app, and that's kind of a community message board, and that's helps a lot. For email, we have a Google group, which is essentially just an email distribution list where everybody's just on that. That's helpful for sending out emails. Communication is extra complicated because of COVID. We haven't been using Zoom because we live so close, and so we just hang out in the yard or around the bonfire, try to be doing that. So we haven't been leveraging Zoom too much. There is a church, it's called Salvage Yard Church, and we will be meeting around the bonfire this winter. So it is a special church of hardy individuals who, standard attire is a full suit, now that it's starting to get cold. So but it's around the bonfire too, and that's cool. We'll see what happens when temperatures go negative. And that's a high level understanding of the different rhythms and communication methods that are happening in our community. And Kent, you also did mention core commitments, and the core commitments in our community are they are faith, simplicity, and purity. And those are taken from in the 6th century, different Christian orders took vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity. And so it's kind of taking that and putting a more modern words to it of faith, simplicity, and purity. So yeah, those are our core.
Thanks, Andrew. I love the specificity. Ultimately, the rhythms of attention, the ways that we communicate and connect around our core commitments is so absolutely unique to each context. Those Minnesota gatherings in the middle of January are absolutely unique.
Yup.
We don't do that in Abilene, Texas, in that way. So, but that is I think that is the nature of the God who is unity in diversity, right? The diversity, the differentiated beauty of God's life, and it takes on special form in each place. We can't franchise these communities. And I think one of the most important things that young people or people who are just kind of stepping into community need to hear is you will learn a world from spending time with our friends in the Bruderhof or in Genesis community or any of the communities will have wonderful things to teach you. But ultimately, you, the Holy Spirit, and the real life people that you're on the ground with will have to co-discover what are those rhythms of attention? What does that deep, rich life of community look like in our context? And that will grow clear for a time, and then it'll have to change again. So there's not a simple formula for any of this. Thank you for those insights, Andrew. Let's go to you next, Laura.
Thanks, Kent. I think I just wanted to highlight a few of the things that are kind of fundamental to, they're not communication strategies, but they're sort of the softer edges of what helps us to communicate well. And obviously one of those things is to feel connected to each other. And so I feel in our community that, we get bogged down if me and one other person, all we ever talk about is logistics, or who's doing what. And so it's super important for good communication to have healthy relationships that are built on all the sort of leisure and fun that can happen in community. So in a lot of ways, I think our communication depends on the quality of our relationships and our trust in one another. And the other sort of softer edge that I was thinking that I didn't mention about our circle way practices. So we have an interesting situation. I assume the Bruderhof has a lot of people who are members of the community, but not necessarily physically present in all the communities. We have we're a community of 2 families that live on a farm and one that lives in town, and our relationships have been different since COVID, but we have kept the same sort of container for holding our meetings, using these circle way practices. So we meet on Zoom, which is strenuous. We meet on Friday nights from 8:30 to 10, and it's a hard time to meet. It's a hard time to be in front of the computer. But I think the practices that we have set out, and one of the main ones, I'm getting to the point, I think, the softer edge is that we open each, we have a candle and we pray, and then we have a poem, or whoever's facilitating, we have a rotating facilitator. Whoever's facilitating the meeting also brings something to inspire us, which we really need on a Friday night, sitting in front of a computer. And I feel like the inspiration that we get from collectively listening to these words kind of puts us in a different space. And from that, building a relationship, doing our check-ins, and then doing any conflict resolution stuff, then we're ready with clear hearts to enter into any sort of logistical stuff that we have to address. So I think paying attention to the quality of relationship and what is inspiring us and putting us in a place to receive other people's words and other people's is really important. I think that's it.
Well, that's really super helpful, Laura. In our community, we often begin our rounds with our conversations with gratitude. We've learned that, there's so much about the way we're wired as humans in the image of God that really reaches toward the relational when we notice what we're grateful for. So there's lots of brain science behind that, but we've just found an experience that often really helps with those soft edges you're talking about there, the ways of remembering, oh yeah, these are people I love. this is a story that I'm in that I get to be a part
Mhm.
of. And yeah, 8:30 on a Friday night, we totally get that. You know, families with small children kind of often need a way to, you know, to have the kiddos down and be able to make those connections. But
Mhm.
what a powerful reminder that the relationships themselves are such a key to deep and good communication. Chris, let's go to you next.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that were on my mind have been said already. For us, certainly, I've kind of already alluded to one of the most important things is the intentional weekly space for conversation. I mean, particularly since we're probably more like a traditional church congregation than some communities represented here, and kind of like Laura, the situation that Laura was describing, that we're kind of scattered a bit. A lot of people here in our neighborhood, but also a number of folks kind of uh, in further flung places around the city. Um, so actually committing ourselves to having an intentional space where we're going to learn to continue to learn to talk together, and amidst kind of, I appreciated, Kent, what you said about kind of the always changing dynamics and the ways that we learn and are shaped by stories and experiences of other communities, but ultimately we have to learn to find our way together amidst all the sorts of particularities of our own people and our own place. So I think that's really important. And one other thing I just wanted to highlight that has come up a couple times already in what Claire said and what Laura said, and that's the role of trust. I think for us, one of the biggest and best fruits of our practice of conversation together over the last 25 years or so is that we are learning to trust one another in conversation. We don't still have many disagreements, still kind of all over the map in a lot of different ways, but by creating spaces in which we can listen to one another, which we can grow in our knowledge of one another, we are learning to trust one another, and that trust gets manifested in lots of different ways in our life together, and the choices we make, and the sort of economics that we have, the businesses that we start. All of those things require some degree of risk, which has to be navigated with a degree of trust. So I definitely wanted to kind of highlight from our own experience the importance of trust that is cultivated through good communication with one another over time. Again, these things that as we've said, are messy or slow. There's not really a lot of shortcuts, but we learn it as we walk alongside one another and talk and seek to know one another and to know the presence of God among us.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I appreciate that so much. And I kind of reading several ways that you said this in both your comments so far. The point that those regular rhythms, even if it's just once a week and on a Sunday evening, has a way of spilling over into all these other dimensions of life together. And so the practice in one arena creates a new kind of competence for communication, better communication in the other contexts. So I really appreciate the importance of
Can I add one other thing?
Yeah, sure.
I think oftentimes, certainly I've been in and around intentional Christian communities for several decades now. But it seems that, it seems like a lot of the folks that are attracted to intentional communities, there's a very strong sort of activist mentality of wanting to get stuff done. And I think I've been learning through my experience at Englewood and experience with other communities that that while very well intentioned, that also has to be tempered with good communication, with really trying to understand the sorts of dynamics and relationships within which we must act at any given time. And so that yes, we must act. We must take stands and move forward and make decisions. We do best when we are attentive and communicate well in those regards. So anyway, that's just something that I've learned and we've learned through our experience here at Inglewood.
So important. Yeah. The words of Jesus that come to mind, roughly translated, apart from me, you can do diddly squat, right? And we so often are in our longing to see things right and just, eager to get into the fixing of things and into the making of things happen. And the only problem with that impulse, which I think is from God, is that we often have no clue what God is up to. And it really does take the community and God speaking in and through the community. Back to what Claire was saying earlier, I don't have to get my way if I know that my voice has been heard and that others who also carry the Spirit of God may well have more wisdom than I have, or have a different angle on the wisdom that we're needing to take action on. So again, this is a challenge for us Americans. We tend to want to get after it, make things happen. If it is to be, it's up to me, et cetera, et cetera. We have all these things that kind of are part of our cultural water and air that we live in that are not always attuned to the leading of the Spirit in the community. And that brings me maybe to the last question. We're going to have to kind of pick up the pace here a little bit. Maybe each of us just address this briefly, but in light of that truth, what role does effective communication play in making good decisions in your community? How does your community find ways to attend to God in one another so that the decisions you're making really are the decisions of Jesus and not just the most vocal or the strongest personality or the person who wants something the most? And so Claire, again, let's just come back around to you and let you take it from there. Be sure to unmute here first.
Yes, that's the very reason that we practice making our decisions by consensus. That we won't, when it's a large decision, we lay it out before the brotherhood, and we will not go forward and make a change until everyone is in agreement. And oftentimes it does mean waiting for someone to be convinced, or let's put it this way, that everyone is at least not in disagreement. And we will have when we were smaller, it would be each person speaking to it. Encourage that as much as possible, but at some point you have to, give a yay or a nay kind of thing. But what I think is really important is that if you have made a decision in consensus, and your community goes forward with that decision, and by its very implication, making a decision implies change, and making going in a direction where you have a choice of one or another situation. It's really important that once that has been made by consensus, that everyone puts their shoulder to it and that you move forward, that you don't hold back or withhold the opportunity to say, I never really agreed with that in the beginning. That's not helpful to any kind of corporate progress. You've made a decision in consensus and you've made it together, and you can also unmake it together. But the most important thing is you do it together. And I found, that's for big things, but I personally have also found that my own way of making decisions in smaller things or coming to situations in my daily work, I much more readily will go and talk to a couple of people and get their input than I would have before I came to the community. I've learned how important it is to get some other ideas and impact on it and input on it before you go together and before you make a decision. So I've become much more consensus building, I would say, over the years I've been in the community.
It's really good. Again, every voice gets heard. Maybe not everybody gets their preference, but we're making the decision collectively, and we can live with that decision. So we get to consent. Yeah, that's really good. Andrew, what would you add?
Sure. So there are different forms of communication. There's verbal and nonverbal communication when you're talking with a person, but then there's also written communication. So the written communication for our community that we have is the Genesis Community Covenant and Practice. So if anybody, let me just breeze through that. Mission and vision statement, statement of faith, values, lifestyle commitment of simplicity, purity, and faith, membership layers, involvement, decision-making process, member accountability, and then in the practice, house rules, shared spaces, stages of life, your contribution to shared expenses, guests, hospitality, personal accountability, membership layers, leaving the community, engagement expectations and teams. So there's basically the whole life in community, trying to boil it down into a written communication so that and have it be flexible so that whenever there's needs for any changes, that's there. That's helpful for some that like to just just know, okay, where are things at? And so written communication is one way that we've been able to express. My second thought on effective communication is that we are all God's ambassadors. We are his messengers. And our commission is to make God's love be known. And how do we do this? First with our actions, and second with our words. So the words we use and the tone that we have when we communicate has the power to make God's love be known. And that's very powerful in our walks here in community.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really helpful. The NCN network is in the process of gathering up some of those kind of community covenant statements, those written documents, and that will be, I think, a wonderful resource in years to come for us to be able to kind of look at each other's ways of kind of putting to pen and paper sort of the heart of what we have agreed to do together. Again, no one's got the one true way to do this, but we can learn a lot from seeing how God has led others into this kind of agreement. That's really helpful. Thank you. Laura, let's go to you next.
Thanks. I don't know if I have a huge amount to add. I feel like the main components to discerning, God's voice among our voice, I resonate strongly with what Claire said, that it's about listening well to one another and space to speak our reservations or our disagreements until we find within ourselves and sort of corporally that we are settled, that there's a feeling of being settled. And then the only other thing I would add is just that it's so helpful to have the mission statements or our core values, things like that, and making sure that our decisions are aligned with pointing to and moving on the values that underlie our life together. So if there is doubt or disagreement, it's helpful to be able to go back and look at those and be like, are one of these options not in line with our values, or does one of them promote them more? So I guess in a way it's just using the wisdom of decisions we've already made together can help us if we're at an impasse in moving forward. But basically it's about listening to one another, really listening.
That's really, really well said. Chris, what would you add as we're winding up this part of our time together?
Yeah, really, I don't have a whole lot to add to what's already been said. Certainly echo Laura in appreciation of what Claire said about just really trying to make space as we're making decisions for listening to others. Obviously, sometimes we live under the pressure of time and other sorts of dynamics. So we may not always get to have as much listening and conversation before a decision needs to be made in certain circumstances, but trying to do that as much as possible. And then kind of looking back to what I said before about the importance of trust, that just having intentional practices of conversation, of learning to be and talk together really helps us in the times when we do have to make decisions more rapidly. We have some sort of body memory, as it were, that allows us to move and to act more gracefully under pressure, because we have kind of cultivated good communication through habits of talking and being and knowing.
Thank you, Chris. That's so helpful. Our community has found it really helpful to work with a basic process for governance called sometimes dynamic governance or sociocracy. There's a number of several good books on the topic, Many Voices, One Song, several others. We'll be gathering some resources from this conversation to share with you all in terms of some best practices, some ways to go about this kind of deep, attentive discernment together in community, listening well to one another. Lots of tools out there, but again, each community has to, with the help of the Spirit, find those rhythms that work for them. Well, panelists, let me thank you for some really rich insight, wonderful things shared here. What we want to do at this point in the conversation is let you, as a group, spend some time with a few others to talk about two things. I'm just going to highlight it real simply here, and then you'll see the specific questions on your screen as we move into the chat rooms. But the two questions would be, broadly speaking, what have you heard that seems really important to you in the course of our panel discussion here? What strikes you as particularly important? And then secondly, where do you see opportunity for growth in the community that you're in? If you were going to point to an area or two where you feel like, wow, this is an area that we could do better in, this is an area where we could grow, what would you identify? Maybe do 2 rounds on that. We'll have about 20, 25 minutes, maybe about 20 minutes actually at this point to do this. So when you move into your rooms, if you would briefly introduce each of yourselves, where you are, your community, just take a half minute on that each, and then decide who might be able to record the insights that are shared. We want to continue to gather information from the communities around all these discussions. So have someone serve as your scribe that would be willing to write those things down, and then share around those 2 questions. What have I heard that seems really important to me and my community? And 2, where do I see an area for growth? All right, does that sound like a plan? We'll try to be back by about 25 after or so, just to give us a few moments to wrap up our conversation together. Let's Andrew, go ahead and move into those chat rooms then.
All right, sending people now.
Well, it looks like we are all back from the breakouts here. I hope your community's conversation was as rich as ours. We had a great time together. One of the things we've talked about in the NCN team is just how rich it is to spend time talking to people from other community expressions around the country, whether they're old timers or really just finding their way into this for the first time. And I hope that in 2021, we'll have more occasions to share at that more personal level together. I think that's just so rich, has been for me each time we've done it this year. So thank you all for your participation. For those of you who kept the notes for your groups, if you have the time to put those notes up on the chat here, we would welcome that. If not, I'm going to invite you, and Nancy, I hope this is okay with you, to send those by email attachment back to Nancy. You should have gotten the invitation from Nancy, Joe and Nancy. So just send those notes back to her, and we'll be compiling those for our ongoing records, and also for the information we'll be sharing with others about this conversation. Thank you for all of those contributions. What a joy it's been to be with you this morning. You know, as we move toward our next conversation, I just wanted to remind us that Jesus said to his disciples, you are the light of the world, you're the salt of the earth. But before he said that, he said, this is how people will know that you are my disciples, by the quality of love that you have for one another. Jesus said there's going to be something so distinctive, so unique about the way you love each other, that the world will witness it. They'll see it in action, and they'll say, those are disciples of Jesus. And I think that is the foundation for our actually being salt and light in a world that is tasteless and it is dark. And it feels like in these days, growing more rotten and darker. Our ability to be salt and light is so linked to our being able to communicate the love that we have for each other in the clear, concrete, tangible ways we've been talking about today. And that ultimately, I think, leads us to the question that we want to really pursue or explore, think about for our next meeting on this coming Saturday, which is really that question of salt and light in a world that's tasteless, in a world that threatens to go bad, to use the meat metaphor, in a world that is dark and seems to be darkening, to use the light metaphor. How do you see your community and its communication working as salt and light in the world? How does the way that we are loving one another tangibly impact the world around us? You know, salt doesn't have to be the majority of what's present for meat to be preserved and tasty. It has to really just be a tiny percentage. The sky doesn't have to be full of light to be lit up by the moon and the stars. And I think in a very analogous way, we're called to be small but profoundly transformative impacts on the world in our time. And I think our communication is obviously a key to that. So how do you see that happening in your community? And if you'll bring that question in prayer and in thought with your community's input to our conversation next week, I think that'll make for a rich conversation. Dr. Alden Bass will be leading that conversation. Alden, anything you want to say as we're wrapping up by way of encouragement to the group here?
Well, I think that we're going to enter a tumultuous week next week, given all that's going on in the country. And even as I think many of us try to maintain some healthy distance from what are often toxic conversations, that we have a lot of opportunities to witness this life-giving communication that we're talking about. So I think we'll come to the conversation next Saturday, perhaps with some pretty fresh stories of how we personally or communally are salt and light in this particular moment.
Thanks, Alden. Thank you all for being here today. It's always a joy to be with you. May God bless you this week, and may we all continue to grow in our influence as light and salt, living the life of love that God has poured into us. Bless you as we go our ways today.
Amen.
Thank you all. Nice.
Thank you.
Adiós.
Adiós. Bye bye.
Thanks, Ken.
Hasta Cristo.
Wow. Bendiciones. Bye.
Bye for now, friends.
All right.